Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today in this video, we will have a React interview question. That is, we will simply fetch the data from an API in React. So without wasting any time, let's start the video. So we will fetch the data from JSON placeholder, which is a free fake REST API, generally used for learning and testing purposes. So you need to go to simply Google and type JSON placeholder API and simply open the first link. There you will find this link. So you need to use this link. So let's first have the component, then we will use this link. So I'm using this shortcut to have our component simply. Then I already have a simple CSS. Let us import that also. Then simply a div with a class name as simply container. So let's keep this simple for now, as our main focus would be on the fetch logic. So we need a useState hook and we need to have a state variable. So let's have it with a name as simply data, and the function which will update the value of this state variable data, simply you set data. Then with the initial value of this state variable, simply an empty array. So why empty array? As the data that we will fetch from this JSON placeholder will be an array of objects. So that's why we need to have empty array here. And we need to have one more state variable. Simply it will keep track of our data being fetched or not. So simply let's give the name of this as simply is data fetched, and the function simply set is data fetched. So initially it would be simply false. So it means initially it is false. It means initially our data is not being fetched. So as soon as we fetch the data, we will set this to true. So it will keep track of our data being fetched or not. Then we need to have simply use effect. So simply your use effect hook with an empty dependency array. So why empty dependency array? It means we want this, whatever logic we will write inside our use effect hook, we want this to happen only once. So inside the use effect hook, we will write our data fetch logic, and we want our data to be fetched from the API only once. It means in the initial render, that is the first render, when we first refresh the page, we want the data to be fetched only once. So that's why we have empty dependency array. So now let's have the logic to fetch the data. And you can also use promises to fetch the data from API, that is then catch. But I'm going with async await as I find that easier to use. So simply, so let's give the name of this function as simply fetch data. Then simply you need to have async, and you need to call this function as well. And it is a good practice to have always try and catch block inside the async await. So whenever you will use async await, it's always a good practice to have try catch block or finally block as well. So why this try catch and finally block? So inside the try block, we write the code that needs to be tested, right? So what do you mean by needs to be tested? So as here in our code, Inside the try block, we will write the logic to fetch the API. So if we try to write the logic of API, it will give two conditions or maybe two cases. Either our API fetch will be successful or it will give error. So it means it is a kind of testing only. So we are testing the logic for errors or for successful completion. So that's why we will keep that logic inside our try block, and this catch block will catch errors. And whatever we keep inside this finally block, it will run irrespective of there is error or we have successfully fetched the data or not. So the logic inside the finally block will always run. So here we will have the logic to fetch the data. So simply let's give the variable name as our response data. Now we will use await. So what this async keyword does, it marks the function as asynchronous. It means it says that it can handle the task that will take time. And this asynchronous means simply, let's say your API fetching or your file reading or maybe your other asynchronous work. And this await keyword pauses the execution of code inside your async function until the awaited task is complete. So in our case, the awaited task is simply your API fetching. So simply, and we will use this fetch method of JavaScript. So this fetch method is an inbuilt method of JavaScript that is used for making HTTP request. So let me write it down. So it is simply your inbuilt JavaScript method that is used to make HTTP request. So the HTTP request means, let's say the GET request. So GET request you do when we want to read or get the file or maybe the data from API. Or maybe your post request. So with this post request, you send the data to the API or your database. Let's say when you fill the registration form and when you click submit, you are generally sending your data to the database. So although we have more requests, HTTP requests, so you can learn about them maybe some other time. But for now, our main focus is on API fetching. So simply we will use this fetch method. Now here we need to provide the URL, that is the JSON placeholder URL. So you need to simply copy this. So if you run this script, see we have this data. So simply copy this till here to do's and simply paste it. And for your catch block, simply you will catch the errors that you will get while fetching the data. So simply your error. So now the data that you get by this fetch method will be simply your response object. So let me show you first, then I will explain. So see, when you use this fetch method, so you got this response object. And this is the most important part of this logic. Most of the developers get confused in this part only. So let me show you. So as I already told you, this is your response object. that you get when you use fetch method. So let's assume it to be a response object. So let's say this is your response object, and inside your response object, you will have your headers, status code, and other things. So your headers, your status code, or maybe other things, as well as you will have your response body. So let's say this is your response body. So inside your response body, you will have your readable streams, which is your raw data, which you cannot use directly, which is not usable. So your readable stream, which is your raw data, and as well as inside your response object, as you have header, status code and all, as well as you have response body, and inside the response body you have your actual data, that is your readable stream. So that is raw data, and this raw data is not usable data. We need to convert this data. As well as in your response object, you also have some methods. So methods like dot text, which means this method will simply convert your raw data, that is your not usable data, into your JSON data. As well as you have one more method, that is your .json. So with this, you will convert your data, that is this raw data, into your JavaScript object. Although you have other methods as well, but you need to focus on these two only for your understanding. And we will use simply this .json method as we want JavaScript object, right? And if you don't know about JSON data, so let me give you a brief about this data. So this is your JSON data, simply strings. And this is your JavaScript object, which we need. So when you will use this method, that is .text, you will get your JSON data. And if you use this .json, you will simply get your JavaScript object. So let me show you that. So as we have our response object, simply, so let me first show you the JSON data. Simply your response data dot text to have JSON data, and these methods, like these two methods, the method that you get with your response object also do asynchronous work. So simply we need to use await keyword here also. So let's just console log this. So see, this is your JSON data that you got with this method dot text, but we need our JavaScript object, right? So simply instead of this, and let's change the name of this variable to simply response obj, that is your response object. Then simply to get our JavaScript object, simply let's give the name of this variable as simply JS object. So you can have other names also. I'm only writing this for your understanding. So this time response obj dot JSON, as we want our JavaScript object. And as I told you, these methods also do asynchronous work. So simply here also we need to use await keyword. So now let me show you the JavaScript object. So simply your JSOBG. So see, or let's simply have JS object instead of JSOBG. Simply have JS object only. Or let me show you the exact data, then you will understand. So let me show you this title. So see, here we have the data. So let me show you. So see, we have the user ID, title and all. So we got the JavaScript object. That is our actual data. Now, and inside this finally block, we need to set this to true. It means our data fetching is done. So simply true. And here, instead of console logging, we need to put this data, the actual data, inside our state variable that we had earlier. So simply your set data function. So with this data, simply our JavaScript object. So now we have our data stored in our state variable. And as we have set this to true, it means initially after the first render, that is when we first refresh the page, we are telling that yes, our data fetching is done. It means our data fetching is done. Then we can have two cases. So it means this finally block sets this to true. So it says after the first render, when we first refresh the page, our data fetching is done. The data fetching process is completed. Now we can have two cases, like either we can have successful data fetching or it may give error. True means our data fetching process done. Then it can have the state can be successful. It means the data fetching can be successful or it may give error. And if it is successful, then simply we have the code for successful data fetching. It will simply put our data that we fetched from API into our state variable that we had. And if we have the second case, that is if our data fetching have error, then simply we have the catch block to catch that error. So that's why we set this to true inside our finally block. So as I told you earlier, the logic inside the finally block always runs. So it will always set that to true, telling that yes, after the initial render, our data fetching process is done. And we have our try and catch block for this respective cases. So now the only thing we need to do is we need to show the data in the UI instead of console logging it. So simply now we will conditionally show. It means if our data fetching process is done, if it is true, we have done the processing of fetching the data, then simply we will show the data. If it is successful, in the else part, we can show that we are still fetching the data, a kind of loading. So if this is true, our data will be seen. In the else part, it will say that we are still fetching the data. Then it will show loading. So here we will use map method. That is simply your state variable, that is data dot map. Simply Here, whatever you will write, your whole data will get stored. So simply val with ID. As you know, the second parameter is always ID. Then simply have a div to have the key prop. As we are using the map method, so we should always have a key prop. So that is ID. And inside this, simply we will have our data. So, and as this is your object, so to have the data, simply we need to have val dot title for this title. So let's check. So see, we are getting the data. And what we can do, let's have, simply we can have the ID to have numbers. So see, so as ID starts with 0, so we can have simply, and here also we have got plenty of options in our JSON placeholder. So as you can see, we can have these things also, like post comments. Let's have, instead of this to dos, now I'm showing this to dos. It means this title. So we can also have users. So let's say we want to have simply the name from this users. So what we can do, instead of this to dos, simply we can have users. And now to have this name, simply you can have, instead of this title, simply the name. So see, we are getting the name. So this way you can have photos, albums and all. And initially you can see a loading for some time. To see, initially it is loading. That is the false part. It says our data fetching is still in progress. For some time, short time, you can see that. Then you can see the data, right? So let's have a very quick review. So what we did, initially we have our state variable for storing our data, and we have empty array as the data that will be fetched will be array of objects. Then one more state variable for marking our data fetch operation complete or incomplete. Then simply inside our use effect hook, we have our fetch function. So we used async await, and inside the try block, we wrote the logic that needs to be tested, our API fetch logic. If this logic will give error, this catch block will catch this error, and else part, if the fetch logic works successfully, then it will set the data in our state variable, that is simply the data. And here inside the finally block, we are setting this, or we are marking our fetch data operation complete, and then simply with the help of map method, we have shown the data to the UI. So yes, that's it for this video. Hope you now have a good idea of how you can get data from any API in React. So see you all in the next one. Till then, take care.